What is a Padfoot? Why are they viewed as evil? And what does the broader black dog myth tell us about our relationship with death? Hi everybody, I'm Nick and this is Beasts of the Old World, a channel that explores ancient folklore and mythical creatures from across the globe. If this sounds like something that interests you, then welcome aboard. Many of you will know Padfoot to be the nickname of Sirius Black from the wizarding world of Harry Potter. In these stories, Sirius is an animagus who can change his shape into a large black dog. But Sirius's connection to dogs goes far beyond this. Outside the pages of the wizarding world, Sirius is the name of the brightest star in the night sky, also known as the Dog Star, and is part of the constellation Canis Majoris. You don't need a degree in Latin to know that this translates to Greater Dog. Sirius's link to dogs is pre-established by his name, so it isn't exactly a surprise that a dog is the form that his animagus takes. But what about his nickname, Padfoot? This isn't just a cute name for a dog, it's actually a mythical creature, one of a huge number of large spectral hounds from within English folklore, and indeed across the wider world. Like many spectral hounds, the Padfoot is believed to be an omen of death and appears as a monstrously large black dog with glowing eyes the size of saucers, sometimes accompanied by the jangling sound of dragging chains. While there are many similar myths all over Britain, and indeed all across the world, the Padfoot is generally limited to Yorkshire in the northeast of England, specifically the cities of Leeds and Bradford and a number of villages in the surrounding area. The Padfoot is so named because the victim tends to hear the soft padding of its feet before she sees the creature, or else she doesn't see it at all, hearing the scampering of paws following behind, only to turn around and find that she is alone. She might also report that the Padfoot could teleport, or else that it was able to move great distances silently in the blink of an eye. Other common reports of the Padfoot include seeing the hellhound pace up and down at the front of a specific house where death is soon to happen, or else lay down at the doorstep until it does. Similar to the banshee from Celtic folklore, to see or hear a Padfoot is thought to be a herald of woe. There are also reports of the creature possessing a roar totally unlike that of any other animal, and that speaking to or touching it would give the creature power over you. The most often repeated Padfoot story illustrates this strange last detail quite well. It tells the story of a man who, on his way home late at night, hears the sound of giant paws padding behind him, and is so startled by the huge creature he finds following there that he takes a swipe at it with a large stick. To his horror and confusion, the stick passes straight through the beast without making contact, and so the man turns to flee. He doesn't get far before the hound bites down upon his trailing leg and drags him through the streets and alleys before leaving him, battered and bruised, upon his own doorstep. At first glance, this seems like a strange thing to do, halfway between a punishment and a taxi service, but the tale goes on to say that the man fell gravely ill soon thereafter, and, with no treatment able to cure his strange malady, he died. Now, while the Padfoot is a myth unique to Yorkshire with its own distinct characteristics, it's part of a broader myth of spectral hounds, more commonly referred to as black dogs. What is staggering about this myth is just how far beyond the boundaries of northeast England it really goes, and how many separate individual cases there are to be found. This map just shows a few of the vast number of separate localised myths in the UK, but there are numerous similar myths all around the world, from France and Belgium to Mexico, Argentina and Paraguay, and a number across several US states too. So why so many? Does this huge spread lend any weight to the notion that these creatures might be real in some sense? Or is there another explanation? The names for black dog myths might be numerous and varied, but their associations are far more consistent. There are of course regional exceptions that prove the rule, but this mythological creature is almost always linked to death in some way. It's not difficult to see why. The spectral hellhound almost always appears at night, their huge size is obviously threatening, and the black colour of their fur adds to the association with shadows, darkness, and the underworld. They're often described as having huge glowing eyes, usually red or yellow, which is an archetypal trope of the demonic and supernatural. We've already taken a brief look at the Padfoot myth and found that while the Padfoot did assault the man, it did not kill him outright. Nevertheless, his subsequent illness and death following his encounter with the creature was heavily linked to the event itself by the local folk of the time. This is true of almost every case. Sometimes the dogs are relatively benign, turning up like the banshee, only to herald the approach of death, either by lying down across the front door of the house in which someone was soon to meet their doom, or by appearing alongside them, or a friend, as they journeyed home. Other variations, like the Padfoot, were said to be more aggressive, and it was not unknown for these creatures to attack their victims if provoked. In most of these cases, death follows the encounter, brought about by indirect or mysterious means. The Barghest from North Yorkshire and Black Shuck, who is said to terrorise East Anglia, are hellhounds with a fearsome reputation, sitting at the top end of the aggression scale. While sharing some behaviours with other more benign black dogs, these two have also been known to kill their victims outright, tearing them apart limb from limb. The canine connection with death seems tied to early European mythology associating dogs with the underworld, likely brought about by the scavenging habits of their real-world counterparts, shepherding the dead, as they do, into their own bellies. Dogs in general also have multiple religious connections to death over a surprising number of cultures across the world. Notable examples of this are the Cwnanwn from Welsh tradition, Garm from Norse mythology, and of course Greek mythology's Cerberus. All of these hounds were in some ways guardians of the underworld. But it doesn't stop here. Numerous deities in the ancient Egyptian pantheon take the forms of dogs and jackals, the most famous being Anubis, the god of funerary rites, protector of graves, and guide to the underworld. But there was also Amhe, a minor god from the underworld, another funerary deity whose name means eater of eternity. Then there's Wetpwawit, the opener of the ways, and the jackal-headed Kenti Armentiu, who stood guard over the city of the dead. In Hindu mythology, Yama, the god of death, owns two watchdogs who each have 4 eyes, and the Aztec god of death, Xolotl, was also depicted as a dog-headed monster. It is likely because of this historical association with death that spectral black dogs like the Padfoot are almost always seen as sinister. But they're not just associated with death, they also have connections to crossroads and ancient pathways. The ancient Greek goddess Hecate, whose associations among other things were crossroads, the moon, magic and ghosts, was almost always depicted in the company of dogs. At first glance, crossroads and ancient pathways don't seem sinister at all, and don't seem to relate to death in any way. That is until you realise that these are liminal spaces, places between places, the function of which seems solely to be for things to pass through them rather than to stay. The transition of soul upon death from body to the afterlife is another such liminal space, often represented by crossroads or empty ancient paths. One black dog story illustrates this complex tapestry of cultural association quite well. The story takes place in the 1700s near Arncliffe, a small village in the Yorkshire Dales, not far from Malham Cove. This is the story of Bertha and the Barghest.
Long ago, in the days when the old ways still whispered through land, there lived a wise woman, a figure both feared and revered, her name known far beyond the borders of her desolate dwelling. Few tales of her craft have survived the passage of time, but one chilling account has endured, a story whispered in hushed tones by those who dare to recall it. It began in Arncliffe, where a man were in correspondence with a distant friend. In one of his letters, he spoke of Bertha, the wise woman of Littondale, whose mastery of magic and prophecy was unmatched. His friend, intrigued and sceptical, resolved to see for himself whether the tales were true. So he set out from the south, his journey long and arduous, drawn ever northward until, in the early days of autumn, he found himself standing at last before her cottage. It were a forsaken place that time had forgotten, a wretched hovel nestled in a lonely gill near the edges of the village, its walls sagging with age, its windows darkened by tattered curtains, moth-eaten and grey with dust. A place where shadows lingered longer than they should. Before he could knock, a voice, ancient and cracked, invited him in. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of earth and smoke, and the man found Bertha seated on a low stool by a turf fire, surrounded by 3 black cats, watching him with unblinking eyes, and a sheepdog lying silently at her feet. She asked what had brought him to her door, and he spoke of his desire to witness her power, to see with his own eyes the magic that others spoke of in whispers. Bertha's gaze bore into him, and she smiled, a thin, humourless smile. "You doubt me," she said. "You think me a fraud, a mere trickster. Yet you have come seeking proof." She paused, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "Very well. Sit by my fire, and within the hour you will witness a power beyond anything you have ever known." He settled uneasily beside the fire, his eyes wandering over the dim room. The walls were adorned with images of ancient seers and prophets. A cauldron hung nearby, and with it a sack, its contents concealed. 3 stools, an old table, and a few blackened pans were the only other furnishings. Bertha moved with deliberate slowness, drawing a circle of chalk upon the floor, and at its centre she placed a chafing dish, which she filled with embers, glowing faintly. She filled the cauldron halfway with water and bade the man stand at the circle's edge. From the sack she withdrew items that made his blood run cold. Bones of various sizes, the desiccated remains of small creatures, and a skull, its hollow eyes seeming to follow his every movement. Into the cauldron they all went. She began to chant, her words an ancient language long forgotten by the world, as the cauldron began to bubble and steam. The man's heart pounded in his chest as Bertha took a glass in her hands, dipped it into the bubbling waters and handed it to him, instructing him to gaze through it and into the cauldron's rising steam. He obeyed, and as the steam swirled before his eyes, a figure emerged. A man, sick and pale of pallor. Recognition struck him like a blow. It were his friend, the very one who had written the letters that had brought him here, the very one who had urged him to seek out Bertha. His hands trembled as the image faded, and Bertha doused the fire with a swift motion. Her eyes glinted in the dying light. "Do you doubt me still?" she asked, her voice a dark challenge. He rose abruptly, turning quickly to leave, but she halted him, delivering one final command before he could flee. "You will go to Arncliffe Bridge at midnight," she told him, her tone grave. "Stand alone, and look to the water upon your left. Do not bring a companion, for the charm will be broken." She smiled thinly. "Don't worry. You will not be harmed, though you may wish you had been by the end." The man turned and fled into the afternoon sun, but its warmth brought him no peace. That night, as he made his way to the bridge as instructed, a full moon hung in the sky, its light casting eerie shapes across the landscape, the shadows playing tricks upon his mind. The river flowed quietly beneath, its surface reflecting the cold blue light of the moon. He waited. The minutes dragged into hours, until finally midnight came. At that moment, a low, mournful moan drifted from the water to his left, and he caught a large disturbance on the river's surface. He peered into the depths, but saw nothing, could find nothing that could account for it. A cold sweat broke out on his skin, and he turned to leave, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he turned, he froze in terror. There, in the middle of the empty street, stood an enormous black dog, wolf-sized and terrible, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow, bound in heavy black chains what glinted in the moonlight. The beast's gaze was locked upon him, and he felt the weight of something ancient and malevolent in that stir. His voice caught in his throat as he tried to say, "Was that you in the river just now?" As he spoke, he glanced away, back to the river, only for the merest of moments. But when he looked back, the giant dog was gone. It hadn't made a sound. Panic seized him, and he fled, resolving to get back to his lodgings in the fastest speed possible. Before long, the sound of scampering feet and dragging chains haunted his every step. Again and again he glimpsed the dog, sometimes far behind him, though the noise seemed close at hand, and sometimes far ahead. Sometimes he could not see it at all, though the sound of it grew louder. At last, he saw that it ran right alongside him, huge and fierce and terrible, and his legs crumpled beneath him, and he tumbled to the ground. When he finally reached his lodgings, he dared to look once more. Peeping out of the upstairs window, he could see Dog sitting by the door, watching him with those terrible glowing eyes. He stared back for many minutes, and as he did so, it seemed slowly to fade away into the night like a vanishing mist. That night he slept fitfully, and when the dawn came, he resolved to leave immediately, back to the south, where he might never again encounter such horrors. But something wouldn't let him, and drew him back towards Bertha's hovel. He tried to fight against each step, wanting desperately never again to go near that place, but he could not resist. He found her as he had before, seated by fire as if she'd been waiting for him all along. She did not look up as she spoke. "Tell me, what did you see last night?" He stammered out his account, omitted only the dog, fearing his own sanity more than her judgment. But Bertha, it seemed, knew everything. "And what of the bar guest?" she asked, her tone almost mocking. The what?" His voice cracked. "The dog that guided you home," she said, finally meeting his gaze. "The one that brought you back here." The blood drained from his face as realization dawned. "A bar guest," he whispered, the word catching in his throat. "But that means—" "It does," Bertha interrupted, her voice cold. "I'm sorry for your loss." "But who—" he began, but the answer was already forming in his mind, dread filling the silence that she left. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You already know." Trembling, he returned to the village where a crowd had gathered by the river. There, at the very spot where he had stood the night before, they pulled the lifeless body of his friend from the waters. The friend whose face had appeared in the steam, who had written to him of Bertha. He had drowned himself early that morning, driven to despair by forces neither of them could understand. And as the villagers spoke of tragedy and of fate, the man knew that Bertha's power was no mere trickery, but something far darker, something that had sealed his friend's doom and left its mark upon his very soul.
Given our more modern view of dogs as lovable companions, it can be quite difficult to accept the grisly associations that man's best friend held of old. It is almost certain that the sheer weight of religious and cultural association that dogs have shared with death throughout ancient history have informed the relatively more modern folkloric connections they retain today. That these beasts are overwhelmingly portrayed in folklore as ferocious servants of the devil was not always true in ancient times, but the myth has darkened along with our cultural assessment of what death is and what it means for us as individuals. That said, not all spectral dogs are considered hellhounds, and not all are believed to be agents of the devil or omens of doom. There are some notable exceptions to this rule, viewed instead as benevolent guardians rather than forces of malice. One such example is the Girt dog from Somerset, believed to protect travellers and children and ensure their safety in potentially dangerous environments. The Girt dog is a good example of how local values can be integrated into and form adaptations of a broader myth. Given the broadly positive reputation that dogs have in the modern day, the existence of protected black dog myths is unsurprising. But what is surprising is that there aren't more than a handful of examples. In the future, we may see a shift away from the death-bringing hellhound myth, replaced increasingly by more positive canine figures like the Girt dog. If I had to make a prediction, I would guess that such future dog myths would not be guides or guardians of physical spaces like the lonely roads and dark forests of old, but of mental and spiritual spaces, forming a positive inversion of the black dog symbolism surrounding depression and anxiety. Alternatively, we may see a reinterpretation of the black dog omen to align more closely with the original meaning of the banshee as a protector against grief rather than a bringer of death. Only time will tell. I also wonder if communities that emphasise protection and guidance over fear and danger might be able to reinterpret the black dog myth to align with their cultural narratives, creating stories where these creatures are allies rather than threats. People who believe in the Girt dog's protection, for example, might feel more secure travelling at night or allowing children to play outside, fostering a sense of safety and community trust. Surely preferable to the paralysing fear induced by tales of malevolent black dogs. Don't go out alone, for the devil and his dogs are waiting for you. As with all mythical creatures, what I find fascinating is what they and their surrounding mythologies say about us as people, about who we once were, about who we are, and about who we might yet become. Myths, much like dogs, take on the characteristics of those around them. If you have a society in which dogs are primarily used for security and conflict, then the dogs in your mythologies are likely to be fearsome and terrifying. The unequivocal malevolence of the ancient black dogs of myth tells us a good deal about the societies from whence the myth originated, and a good deal about the dog's role and function in those societies. They also tell us that dogs generally, not just ghost dogs, were once creatures that should be feared, creatures kept for security rather than companionship. But as people change, the myths change with them. Protective black dogs symbolise hope and benevolence in the face of danger and the unknown. For now though, the black dogs of folklore remain the fearsome, spectral hellhounds of old, illustrative of our fear of death and the unknown that waits beyond that veil. So the next time you're walking home in the dead of night and you feel the stare of eyes at your back, remember the Padfoot. folklore in its blackest tales lights candles in rooms we might otherwise keep dark. These myths remind us of our distant past and hint at the future we have yet to have. They help us to discuss the eternal question of our mortality and what, if anything, comes after. And most of all, they assure us that when death eventually comes, as he will for us all, his loyal, obedient dogs will not fail to deliver us. Thank you for joining me on this journey into our shared mythic past. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, and please share it if you think you know other people who'll enjoy it too. Subscribe, turn on notifications to never miss a new episode, and until next time, keep a wary eye out for large glowing eyes on your way home. And if you should hear the soft padding of feet behind you, remember that the beasts of the old world still roam wild today.